Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Wiebe. I'm with the Bridges 2 East Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our third episode of Critical Conversations about Cognitive Diversity with our host, Scott Barry Kaufman. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Scott's guest, Dr. Matthew Fugate, who is an assistant professor in educational psychology at the University of Houston downtown. He received his doctorate in gifted, creative, and talented studies at Purdue University. His primary area of research is in the identification and services for students who are twice exceptional. He's also part of a federally funded grant looking at the academic effects of the total school cluster grouping model. Dr. Fugate's past research has examined the relationship between working memory and levels of creativity in gifted students who have ADHD characteristics. He also examined the coping mechanisms of twice exceptional girls in secondary school as they navigate both their academic studies and interpersonal relationships. So without further ado, I hope, Scott, you don't mind me saying this, but our topic today is ADHD and creativity. So quite possibly the most creative and ADHD person I know, Scott Barry Kaufman.
Thank you. I consider that such a compliment. Thank you so much. In fact, I encourage everyone to turn on your videos. It's not a requirement here, but I encourage people to, or else it just feels so impersonal. It's just like me and Matt looking at like all these blank screens, and it's like, we're all yearning for connection, and that doesn't just sit right with me. So thank you for doing that. If you're comfortable doing it, thanks so much for coming to.
I love it because I'm seeing some familiar faces as these squares are lighting up.
Good. You're like, oh, I had no idea that was your name, but I know you based on your picture, your video. No, I'm joking. Cheeky. Well, Matt, thanks so much for being here today. I'm such a fan of your work.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this. I think it'll be a great conversation.
I think so too, if we can focus.
Between the two of us.
Between the two of us, yeah. So look, you had probably ADHD growing up, but it was only diagnosed later in life. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I had graduated from high school. I was here in Houston and in college. And it was like a light bulb went on, because things started clicking into place. Oh, okay, that explains a lot. And so it was really a pivotal moment for me to really get to know and understand myself a little bit better.
Well, what form did it take when you were a kid? Were you having difficulty concentrating in school? Did you, what sort of form did it take?
It was more on the inattentive behaviors, a lot of the issues with working memory. I had a hard time focusing. Reading was torturous for me. I would read. I would sit there and read a page multiple times before I could even begin to comprehend what I was reading. The words didn't have any meaning.
Now, you joked in one of our conversations, you said, I'm really, it was great that I was diagnosed. I found out that I was 1E.
Yeah.
Now I want to unpack that a little bit. So you were not in gifted education as a kid, is that right?
No. As a matter of fact, as a kid growing up in the early 70s, I certainly grew up in a small town in Missouri, and I was in the tracking system. Some of us who are old enough to remember the good old-fashioned tracking system, I was definitely a bluebird, and grade level to grade level, I was always a bluebird, and so things were dumbed down for me. And the challenge was not there. There was not an expectation of being gifted. And it was tough.
So did you feel like this, this like confusion over that, considering you knew you were capable of more? Because I felt that way.
Yeah, it wasn't so much in elementary school. It really started, that realization really started more in middle school and high school. By then we had moved to a different city, and so, you know, I was out of the tracking system, but I knew that I was learning differently. I was experiencing school in a way that was completely different than a lot of my friends. But my saving grace in high school, I became involved in speech and drama. Those of you that know me, shocking. But yeah, I became actively involved in speech and drama. I also became editor of the school literary magazine, got involved in yearbook, and so I really found creative outlets to help me compensate for where I struggled academically. Math to this day is still nearly impossible for me.
And that's not an indication of ADHD
No,
necessarily.
No.
That's maybe you just suck at math, you know.
Most likely.
That's a thing. That's a thing by itself.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's funny because when I was younger, I used to blame everything on my learning disability. It was pretty funny,
Yeah.
you know. When I was in special ed, I used it as a crutch in a lot of ways. Why don't you socialize more with the kids? I found the kids so annoying. Like, I have a learning disability. It makes it hard for me to concentrate. Anyway.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
Hey, look, I want a professional question.
Sure.
What is ADHD? What is it? What are the common characteristics of it?
So, we spent so many years, certainly, we spent a lot of years looking at it more as a behavioral issue, and we've really come to understand that it's more neurological, that you've got executive functioning issues going on. Of course, you've got issues with the impulsivity, the inattentiveness, and those are all the things we know. But there are so many potential strengths that can come with it. When we talk about the creativity piece, and we start to look at kids, comparing those kids with ADHD to kids without ADHD, and we start to look at creativity and divergent thinking, and we see that there's so much potential there, and I don't like, and even like you talked about your learning disability, I don't like to even talk about disabilities.
Yeah.
I
tend to call them just difficulties, learning difficulties.
I call them differences, right? They're learning differences.
That's what I call them too.
Disability is not can't. It means can't, right? Or a challenge. A difference is I just do it in a different way. And
yep, I just do Calc 3 in a different way than what's required to get an A. That's right. We're all just different. Look, I I'm a cheeky. That's in my sense of humor.
I know.
But
I know.
Deep respect for what you're saying, and I titled this book, this Twice Exceptional book that I edited, that you wrote the chapter. That's where I discovered you. The subtitle of that did have the phrase "learning difficulties" in it, and I'm really fascinated with this reconceptualization you have of ADHD as attention divergent hyperactive giftedness.
Yeah, ADHD.
Wow. ADHD.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So that's there's so much to unpack there, because it's like, does every one of those things, like always come together in people? Like sometimes you have kids that are intellectually gifted, but not very divergent thinkers, right? Sometimes you have do you know what I mean? Like I'm being like super nuanced here, but how do you see how do you see that as a gestalt?
Well, so I see it as, you know, again, taking that deficit and disorder out of the conversation, right?
Gotcha.
And divergent doesn't have to mean divergent thinking. It means that my attentions and interests are broad. That it's not that my attention is a deficit. It's just that I've got a lot of things commanding my attention, and that piece, when we think about even this idea of lowered latent inhibitions, you know, with kids with ADHD, and
Sure.
you know, I always use the visual like this for neurotypical folks. You can hone in your vision like this, right? You can focus your attention. For me, it's like this. The blinders are way open, and all this information is pouring in, and that's where that attention divergence comes from. That can lead to that hyperactive giftedness. That I want to know more about this. I want to delve into this. I want to, you know, I want that creativity piece, some of the strengths.
Yes.
And I'm not, and you know, I've had people tell me, but the challenges are real. Believe me, I know the challenges are real. I live through the challenges. I still live through the challenges. But yeah, the words we use matter. The words we use matter.
They do, and they matter in how we think of ourselves as well. Do you think? Well, let me ask you. What do you think of? What is 2E? What does 2E mean to you? What does the giftedness part mean to you? If I zoomed in on that, double click on giftedness. On giftedness. What do you?
All right, we got the ADHD piece in. So I am so, you know, my background, it will come as no surprise. You know, my master's is in gifted education from the University of Connecticut. My PhD from Purdue. I am very much in the Joe Renzulli lineage. And so but I really, especially when we're talking about these kids, that idea of gifted behaviors really resonates. When we talk about that high ability, creativity, and stick with itness, that converging to those gifted behaviors in certain kids at certain times under certain circumstances. You know, we put a lot of pressure on our gifted kids, and now I'm just talking in general. We put a lot of pressure on our gifted kids. We identify them, and then when they struggle in math, well, why? I don't understand why you're struggling. You're gifted. You should be good in math.
Right.
No. You know, I'm people may call me doctor, but you shouldn't come to me for a health checkup, right?
Right, like a medical diagnosis.
That's not me. We don't expect adults to be good in everything, but we make that demand of our kids, and it's not fair.
So it sounds like you have a more malleable, domain-specific conceptualization of giftedness. And I'm reading between the lines and what you said.
Yeah.
So, but you still think that it's a thing that exists, that there's still value in identifying kids who are off the charts, high ability in some way. Still,
and I apologize. I was cupping my ears. I don't know if y'all could hear the doorbell rang, and our four-legged doorbell went off. So I didn't know if it was coming through the microphone.
Oh no, I didn't hear it. I don't
Okay.
know. I don't think anyone else did then.
Okay.
You're safe. You're safe. We're safe.
All right.
We're safe from the assaults on our ears. So hey, I don't know. I keep saying hey to you today. I don't know why. I noticed that. But I'm trying to be chummy. You know what I mean? Like, hey, bro. So I am curious. Like the idea of being ADHD being underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed in the giftedness population? How do you see it? What do you see, an underdiagnosis of giftedness in the ADHD population because some of their ADHD characteristics sometimes trump their giftedness? Have you seen that?
So, I mean, I think in general in our 2E population, we have a lot that goes unidentified because of the potential for masking. And so which side of the scale gets under-identified? I think once a student, unfortunately, becomes identified for special education services, it almost shuts down any opportunity for them to be identified as gifted, because a lot of our educators don't understand it. This idea of twice exceptional is really an oxymoron. How can you be gifted but also need special education services? And so it creates this battle almost in the minds of a lot of our educators. And so I think certainly once that special education label is assigned, I think it's much more difficult for a child to be recognized as gifted.
I mean, gifted education is a form of special education. I mean, this is how I think of it. I don't understand why we have that dichotomy, right? I mean, it's not like because some people think of gifted education, not people in this group at all listening, but some people think of gifted education as elitist. Think of it as you're somehow saying these kids are better than the rest of the kids.
Right.
And I think that, having this model where it's just another form of special education, special needs, helps reduce the stigma, I think, as well, of both gifted and special. Does anyone agree with me on this? Tell me if you agree with me in the chat window. I don't know. Isn't it tough, like talking to the wind?
But to that,
I mean,
point,
you're not the wind. You're not the wind, but
no. But to that point, I think where the problem is, I agree with you 100%. I mean, Moon and Reese talk about, giftedness in itself is an exceptionality because it's outside the norm. But because we are a patchwork of gifted education laws and policies that vary from state to state, and sometimes even within states from district to district, it can be difficult. Unlike our special education laws and policies, which have a overarching federal mandate, our gifted education kind of goes unidentified out there. And it's left up to states and local education agencies to make that determination of what that looks like and what that is. And so it gets lost.
Absolutely. We're on the same page on that, Matt. You've done some really cool studies, and I want to highlight them because there's rich nuance in those studies. And so maybe you can talk through some of the scientific findings. I put a link in the chat window if everyone wants to scroll up to see if you missed it, to a Scientific American. Do you ever see I wrote a Scientific American piece highlighting your work?
Yes, and that was the one that looked specifically at gifted ADHD and creativity, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah.
And can you tell us about the study you did on I believe there were summer camp students, and you looked at different groups, and you had a control group, I believe, that weren't selected for their giftedness, to really parcel out the difference between working memory and giftedness. To me, that's the level of nuance I want to have in this discussion, and I know we're all nerds here, so we're all going to love this. So, and I say nerd in the most positive way imaginable. So, so if you could please talk a little bit about that study.
Yeah, and so in that study, it was students who were attending a summer residential camp in grades 5 through 12. And we started out really just kind of looking at those students. We used the Connors self-report student rating scale And so at that point, we weren't requiring that they provide us with a definitive definition. So in that study, we talk about characteristics of ADHD. And so using some pre-interview questions with families, as well as the student self-report on the Connors, we were able to parse out those students who were demonstrating those characteristics of ADHD. And then we, and so that helped us form that group, right? And then we had our group, all of the students who attended the camp were gifted and talented. It was a gifted and talented camp. And so that piece was already baked in. And so those students who were part of the study then became part of our gifted control group. And then we took them through a series of tests through the Woodcock-Johnson, looking at fluid intelligence and working memory. Also took all of both groups through the Torrence tests of creative thinking.
Nice.
Yeah. And so in that obviously we're defining operationally defining creativity as divergent thinking. And it was really interesting because when we got down to the analysis, what we found was the students who were gifted with those ADHD characteristics showed significantly higher levels of divergent thinking over the students who were gifted without those characteristics. And students who were participants who were excluded from the study, we created a range based upon the final Connors score that we removed so that we could keep the groups distinctly separate. So there was a 10-point range between the minimum clinical score and the students who were part of the gifted control group. And we found a significant difference in that creative thinking ability. And when we took it down to effect size, we came up with a 0.86, if I remember right off the top of my head, effect size. So it really became about providing opportunities for students to express that creativity, to identify that strength that was going in, that was part of that ADHD. And this was really the beginning of my conceptualization of, maybe ADHD needs to be something else. And that was really the start of this idea of ADHD. Oh, you're muted, Scott.
Okay, I said that was the origin story. Thank you for the origin story. Really, really cool work. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is that when you look at the correlation between Torrance tests of creative thinking and measures of executive functioning, you actually find they're quite strongly positively correlated with each other. It requires, which dimensions of divergent thinking did you use? Was it just frequency, or did you also look at elaboration and these other kind of metrics?
We looked at all of the measures and took the final creativity index score and used that as our final measurement for both groups. So we looked across all the dimensions of divergent thinking.
This is super interesting, and I would love a follow-up study that looks to see what particular executive functions, because there's multiple, like inhibition, cognitive flexibility, working memory. There's another one. There's 4 shift setting. Being able to shift between sets. I'd be very interested to see which one mediates the high performance in creative thinking. This is the academic in me thinking, you know what I mean? But wouldn't that be an interesting follow-up study?
I would love
check
that.
The mediators. Yeah.
I would love that. Let's do that, Scott.
Yeah,
You and me.
I can get you. Oh, well, I'd love. Really? I'd love that. I'll get you an online comprehensive executive test, functioning test that can be administered online. I'm sure I can get that. But yeah, I am very interested in that because it just raises a lot of questions, those findings, because we do tend to treat like people with ADHD, particularly, the inattentive type, as though they really have this inability to organize their consciousness.
Yeah.
And yet there's this fascinating finding that keeps cropping up over and over again, which shows that when like hyper focus, hyper flow, which I'd like to talk about, that when you're actually intrinsically engaged in an activity, they can get in even deeper concentration than anyone else.
Yeah.
So that really does add a lot more nuance to the narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah. And when they get into that hyperflow, I as a former second grade teacher, I saw my kids get into that hyperflow, that hyper focus, and then of course the challenge became transitioning them out of it to something else. And it was usually the something else, because I didn't want to discourage what they were doing. So I would find ways, but I taught reading and language arts. Remember, math is hard. And so it would be, the end of my time with them would come up, and I would have to, pull them away and get them to transition to go to the next class. And it would be challenging.
What's the comorbidity between ADHD and autism spectrum?
So I haven't, I'll be honest, I haven't looked into autism spectrum specifically. So I can't say definitively, but I would imagine there would be a lot of correlation in those areas. Certainly we see a lot of correlation between ADHD and dyslexia.
I'm thinking about autism spectrum in particular because on the surface, one could conceptually view them as opposites, in the sense that, well, if autism is this hyper, narrow focus on something to the exclusion of everything else, whereas ADHD is this diffuse focus. But it seems like when you dig deeper into the story, a lot of ADHD students in hyperflow resemble those on the autism spectrum in some regards.
Yeah. And Sydney Zental talked about this in her work in the late 70s, early 80s, about this, the idea of, we thought, again, thinking of ADHD at the time more behaviorally, and we just need to calm them down. Right. When really it was, because they're overstimulated. And she was like, they're not overstimulated. They're understimulated. They're inappropriately stimulated. And so that was that idea of zoning them in on what are those interest areas. And it does share a lot of similarities with students who are on the spectrum, with autism spectrum, because that intense interest and focus, it shows up. But it's just changing the way we perceive it.
I love it. You're really in the forefront of that, and it's not common. I don't see this kind of discussion that we're having right now in a lot of discussions of ADHD. I've had people on my podcast, ADHD experts, talking about, we develop new mindfulness practices to help cure ADHD. I mean, that's how it's all framed. It's like, we want to, help cure them so we could turn them into zombies.
Exactly. And I have a problem with the fix the kid movement. And that's a lot of the ways we think about, you see educators looking at it, approaching it as there's something broken we have to fix. And that puts everything on the child, when really, again, and that goes back to thinking of it as a deficit or a disorder, versus a difference. And a difference means me, the educator, it's my responsibility to find out what that difference is and how to work with them.
Love it. Well, I'm going to open it up to some Q&A questions in a second, if that's okay with you. If there's anything else you want. And before I do, I don't mean to embarrass someone, and if I do, I apologize, but I really believe in highlighting early career researchers who are in this space, since there's so few of them. I noticed that that Amy Egan is actually here and showed up, and she's doing really terrific work at Claremont Graduate University with Andy Conway, who studies working memory and executive functions. And Amy, I didn't know if you felt comfortable at all. Please don't feel any pressure. Please don't feel any pressure, but to just introduce yourself to the group and talk about some of the study you're working on right now. And would you like to do that?
Oh, Amy may be muted too. I don't know if they have.
Can we unmute Amy? I heard just unmuted her, so you should be unmuted. Is your microphone working? It doesn't, maybe it doesn't look like her microphone's working. That's fine. Scott, I think my microphone may not be working, but thanks for giving me the opportunity. Okay, great. So yeah, just putting her on the map here. Okay, so she's doing some really interesting work on mind wandering, and
that's fantastic. And Amy, I would love for us to sidebar, have a conversation. I would love that.
Absolutely. And Amy, put a website or something in there if you have one. Okay, so I now would like to open it up to some Q&A, or anyone else who's a researcher in this space who'd like to tell us about some of your recent findings. This is the kind of community that we're trying to build here with this critical conversations with SBK. So yeah, would anyone like to raise their hand, and then we can unmute you? You know, we can do this Q&A as though you're actually asking me the question, you know, like they do in the real world. So would anyone, all you have to do is click the raise hand emoticon and Stephanie will unmute you.
Hello.
Hey, Carissa. Me? Yes.
Yes. I didn't share my video earlier because I was eating a snack. I have really enjoyed the humor and just the realness of this conversation. I've had a really stressed week, so just kudos to both of you.
Thank you.
That's how we do it. That's how we do it.
I recently got diagnosed with ADHD a year ago, and I feel like things have finally started to get better in my life because I didn't understand why I was the way I was. But now that I'm working at UConn, I'm a graduate student working on the Include project. We're working on neurodiversity and revamping our department. So we share your view a lot, Matthew.
Yeah.
So I was actually wondering, what's the comorbidity of like dyslexia and like ADHD? Because I feel like I might also be dyslexic because reading has just always been hard for me. And I just thought it was like, oh, I don't see things flipped, so I must be fine.
Yeah, we see a lot of co-occurrence. Again, so that's another, comorbidity is another one of those terms that I know is scientifically correct, but it just sounds icky to me. So I always do co-occurrence.
Yeah. Good call. Good call.
We see a lot of co-occurrence of ADHD and dyslexia. It's fairly common, and I have guested on now of course I'm going to draw a blank now, out of New York, the Dyslexia Quest podcast, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but anyway, it comes up. She, you know, I've done it, gone back and been on there a couple of times because there is so much co-occurrence between the two, and you see a lot of that come up. And I think it's because a lot of the information processing issues tend to be very similar. and the way that occurs with students with dyslexia and students with ADHD.
Yeah, so Ellie Sheva Schwartz is the host.
Yeah,
of the
Ellie,
Dyslexia
thank you.
Quest. And she's actually she's a dear friend of mine, and she actually is the reason why I started my podcast, the psychology podcast. She encouraged me 5 years ago to start a podcast. I was like, me, and she believed in me.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
So anyway, check out her.
This is part of my ADHD brain. I lose names easily.
Or is that you making an excuse, like I did with the? Yeah. I'll be quiet. Cool. So, anyone else? Lynn Lim, one of my best students I ever had in the Bridges Academy. She always has insightful things to say, but you certainly don't have to say anything right now. No pressure. But
one of the things I always wonder, and I don't know much about ADHD, but just in general, why is it that I struggle with any diagnosis that requires so many, like a threshold where if you have so many symptoms check off, then you have it. If you don't have enough symptoms check off, you don't have it. So if anybody has any comments on that, it's a big question mark in my mind,
Yeah, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. So please raise your hand and jump into this conversation. Because it's like, if I need 6 and I only have 5, then I'm not right. Well, where is that magic trip line? And I think it does a disservice to a lot of students. Because Amy, you're on.
Yes. Hi, I managed to get my microphone working on my phone, so thank you. I had a couple of comments on that. One, I'm conducting a study right now, but I've already completed a pilot study that actually treated adults with ADHD and self-diagnosed adults as distinct groups. I actually found that adults who had self-diagnosed tended to have sort of symptoms rating scales that were sort of in between, kind of just like what you were talking about. But nevertheless, the median self-diagnosed person in my study was actually above the threshold for diagnosis, which I thought was interesting. But I was looking at a relationship between distractibility and creativity. And interestingly enough, I found the self-diagnosed people also seem to score in between the other two groups on the creativity as well. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing I wanted to say, and I don't have the expertise on this to say anything other than it's something that I've heard and I don't think has been proven false. But I have heard that there is some entertaining of the idea that when we talk about ADHD, instead of it being a disorder, we might be looking at just one extreme end of the spectrum of kind of like normal human variation on a trait. And in that case, it would certainly be possible to be, it's just kind of arbitrary in that case where you draw the cutoff, what's beyond this cutoff or not when you're talking about that spectrum of human variation.
Yeah, and that that's very interesting to think, and again gets back to the idea of a difference versus a disorder, and how and again it's about us changing our perception, not putting the onus on the person, but us recognizing that abilities still exist, and we need to recognize that.
I agree. It's a lot like the giftedness question is like, at what point are you ungifted on that line, and then you're magically gifted?
Yeah.
On the whole continuum.
Yeah.
It's like you missed the 1 IQ point. No, you're ungifted now. you're 114 out of the 115 cutoff.
Yeah.
It's like, or you didn't make it. You didn't make it.
I will not disclose what district it was, but there was a district I worked with that identified students in elementary, but in fifth, they did universal testing in kindergarten and in fifth grade. And I will say they've since corrected this. But at the time, they did universal testing in kindergarten and fifth grade, plus you could identify if that wasn't the one shot, either or, but if you were identified during elementary, either during the universal testing or in first, second, third, or fourth grade for gifted, you still went through the universal screening process and assessment process in fifth grade.
Right.
And if you didn't qualify, re-qualify in fifth grade, the label was taken away. And I was like, I sat down with the administrators and I was like, you need to explain this to me. How can you say that someone is gifted at one point and then go back and reassess and say they're not gifted anymore? At that point, where's the problem? The problem
Where's the what?
Is where if we're saying a child is no longer qualifies, is no longer gifted, is ungifted, then the problem is not with the student, it's with the services that they're being provided. It's with the program, it's with what's going on with that child as far as within the school environment. In other words, we've got to look at ourselves as the educators.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at the situation. I'm kind of down with more fluid gifted programs, quite frankly, that do let you move in and out. So I guess I see it a little bit differently. But yeah, but from the way you phrased it, let you move in and out is at the choice of the student versus taken out by the school and by the administration. So
and that's where I have a problem.
Well, I hear you. I think it's interesting to think about what that can do to the self-esteem of a child who has that label stripped away from them. So I absolutely hear you in that regard. I'm also thinking of the reverse, where I want gifted programs where those who were previously ungifted constantly are reassessed to see if they are then not worthy of resources, but if they would benefit from those resources. So yeah, I think it's tricky. I would like a fluid program that doesn't view giftedness as a thing like you're bestowed with at birth.
Right.
That God has said you're the gifted one, like the chosen one, like the Jews. This is you're the gifted one. But that kind of says that kind of leaves that to be the whole giftedness concept to be something that has to do with like Joe Renzulli has this great quote: giftedness is at a particular time in a particular context. There's this famous Renzulli quote.
In certain people, under certain circumstances, at certain times.
The quote.
The quote. My problem with that situation was, again, that was something that was being taken away from a child by the school, by the district, and administration. So that's kind of that to me that was for me that was problematic, and they've done away with that practice.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that could have a significant impact on a child's self-esteem for sure. Okay, great. Any other questions? Does anyone see today? We're not getting the usual practical, what are the design strategies?
I see Vicky. I see Vicky down here waving her hand. Hi, Vicky.
Hi. I did put my hand up in the chat, but maybe it wasn't seen. It's just really more of a quick, hopefully a quick question. So 20 years ago, when I got my master's in gifted, there was a lot more negative attitudes about medication. And I ended up writing my thesis on misdiagnosis of ADHD. And that where our students just highly creative, lining up the two different columns about what, the same act, the same behavior, and how if you say they're creative, it's a positive thing. If they're ADHD, it's a negative thing. So I now, in the 20 years since, I've changed. I actually now have a doctorate in the ed psych, but that's irrelevant. But as I keep, my studies going, I have a completely different attitude. But the whole medication thing keeps coming back, and I've also seen this in my own children too. So now, with all the studies that you've done, now looking at the ADHD creative student, and I just think it's awesome with that you've noticed the higher level of convergent thinking. Is there any effect on medicated students? Have you seen that stymies any of that?
So we did not factor in medication because, again, because of the nature of the sample that we were pulling from with the kids coming to camp, we had certain limitations on what we could ask them about. So I will be honest, I don't know how many of those students. Well, I know a few of them were just because I knew the students. But I couldn't say how many were taking medication. So, and we identified that as one of the limitations of the study, that was not something that we had controlled for. Medication is a very personal issue. And right. So, and Carissa, I meant to tell you this when you were talking. I did a study on gifted girls with ADHD in their secondary years. It was a collective case study. It was interesting because it varied I had some girls who were on very strict medication regimes, some who eschewed medication, not taking it, and there was one young woman in the study who only took it. She was in high school. She only took medication during high stakes testing periods. Otherwise, she didn't want the medication because she didn't like how it made her feel. And she talked about how it would. That she didn't feel herself, that she felt it to use Scott's term, that it almost zombified her, that it changed who she was. And I will say, I as a teacher, anecdotally, I would see that there was one young girl I had in my class who was a bright light. Not academically gifted, but artistically gifted. Was an amazing painter or drawer. Her eyes sparkled. She was very ADHD. But I saw the inconsistency in her medication, and I could tell when all of a sudden she was on medication again, because that sparkle, that light was gone. And it honestly always made me sad, but when it comes to the medication, it's got to be such a personal issue. It's got to be a personal decision. For some people, it's the right thing. For others, it's not. But it can't be in the case of my student, where it wasn't used regularly. So she could never make that adjustment. She would be on it for a few days and then months without it. because they were only giving it at home. They weren't bringing the medication up to the school.
Okay, so you're not
issues.
Yeah. I'm not even going to go down that. I don't think we should go down that road, but because I agree. I mean, I've seen that benefits and
Yeah.
you know, as well as, you know, negative. But there aren't, because I'm not aware of any research. I was wondering if you were aware of any research then of students that are specifically were medicated versus non-medicated on creativity tasks.
No, and I not that I can recall off the top of my head.
Okay.
I would have to.
Was it White and Shaw? I think one of the studies did study that in adults, and I think didn't find a difference for that variable in adults, I believe.
Thank you.
And White and Shaw had had looked a lot at creativity in adults with ADHD. We've done a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, this is a hot topic in the creativity field, very hot topic. You know, what extent is any medication for any psychiatric disorders affect creativity, and the whole link between mental illness and creativity is also another very interesting rabbit hole that we could go. That's like one degree of separation here from the current topic of conversation. But if there is a link, logically, if there's a link between ADHD and divergent thinking, and you medicate away a lot of the ADHD symptoms, I mean, logically, you know, you're going to affect the creative system in some way. And in what way is unclear exactly. And I wouldn't begin to say exactly understand the mechanisms of operation, but there's sure to have some effect.
Tova, I think I saw your hand waving. Hello.
Hi, Tova.
Oh, you're. Can we unmute Tova?
Unmute. Hello, can you hear me?
There you are. Yep, we got you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. So I have an 8-year-old son who's dyslexic and has been diagnosed with ADHD, and he's also highly anxious. My question about him is, I observe him a lot, especially these days, and he moves around almost constantly. And he talks to himself. And if I ask him what he's talking about, he's usually like invented something. He's very like auditory. He's invented some kind of new mythology, or, you know, written an epic poem or something. But I would say about half the time he is in his own world, being very creative, moving around, talking to himself, and has like not listening at all to anything that's going around. The other half of the time, it seems like he's doing the same thing. He's moving around, he's talking to himself, and yet he hears everything we say and he's paying full attention. So first of all, I don't understand how somebody can be talking to themselves and also listening. That's just like my own thing. I just don't understand. But like, why is it that he's sometimes one way and sometimes the other way? The behavior seems so similar. Is there something affecting it? Because I feel like part of it is like the ADHD and part of it is the giftedness. But yeah, I don't know if you can speak to that.
And so I would, I would venture to say at those times when he's moving and talking and not paying attention to what you're saying, that's incubation. That's focused on whatever that creative thing that he's working on is where he's really, it's bubbling to the surface. He's formulating, he's focused on that. That's one of those hyper flow periods versus the movement, and can be talking to himself and still listen. I mean, that happens at my house on a daily basis. You described me and my relationship with my husband. I'm up, I'm moving, I'm talking, and poor Rob, he's over here trying to get a word in edgewise, and I'm like, and I can still hear him, and he's like, how do you know what I'm saying? You haven't stopped moving. And I'm one of those people who when I'm doing something, I talk my way through it. And so it could be just as simple as what his mind function is at that point in time.
Oh, that's really helpful. And just in speaking to the medication issue, because we've been experimenting with medications because unfortunately my son, he has a lot of trouble reading and writing and also paying attention, especially through Zoom. But what I noticed is that when I give him the medication, he can focus on reading and writing. I don't notice him being less creative, but more anxious. So at that point, it's, what do? Do you enable him to be more focused on what he has to do in school because the school doesn't cater to him or not? So that's just my input about the medication.
Yeah. And that goes back to what I was saying. It really comes down to being this very personal decision for the child and for the family, and what effects is it having. If it's taking that spark away, like Vicki just made a mention, it could be the specific medication. I finally found the chat down here because you're on my screen, you're right by the chat box. And so I saw it pop up. I was like, oh, there we are. But looking at different types of medication and as was the case with the young lady in the Gifted Girls study, where for her the medication became situational.
Yeah.
What do I need at this moment in time?
I'm very concerned. I know we're running out of time, so I probably should wrap this up soon. I'm very concerned with this documentary I saw on Netflix about social media. I think it's still on right now on Netflix, and I just wondered what extent we're making all teenagers ADHD right now. With people are designing the apps in order to make people this certain way, and I wonder, are we going to see an increase in diagnoses based on what we've created in terms of our social media platforms? And
I mean,
anyway.
it could be there's a lot you could go. That is a giant rabbit hole, and I have a lot to say on that one.
Could I mention something?
Oh, anytime.
Could I mention something that I think might be helpful for Tova? I am very in tune with my body and I'm very sensitive. So just as an example, if I'm having trouble sleeping and I need some melatonin, some people may need 5 milligrams or 10. I need 0.25. If I take any more than that, I will be out for a really long time. So maybe kind of talking to your son more and seeing how he feels at different doses, because he may require, a really large dose to be helpful for him, or he may require a really small one. So I started taking medication this summer, and I started off with Adderall, and it was wow, I've never been able to actually focus in my life. But then it completely took away my appetite. So I didn't eat for almost 5 days, very little. So I think talking to him about how he's feeling is really important, and trying different doses. And it's not something that he needs to take every day. Now I take medication every other day, and I don't feel like it's squelched my creativity, but I'm able to focus, which I've never been able to do. I'm still just as fidgety, and I still interrupt people, and I still talk and listen, but it's just really being in tune with your body. And I've struggled in school my whole life and was on high honor roll, dean's list in college, but things have always been exceptionally hard. So now I've discovered the beauty of listening to audiobooks, and I've stopped beating myself up about trying to read. And I just finished reading The Dyslexic Advantage, and reading isn't a necessity. Once you know how to read, just listen to it. We make children think that you have to read. If it's difficult for you, as long as you know how to read and write, that's fine. But if you need to use a keyboard or you need to listen to it, then listen to it. I just finished reading for the first time ever an article for school, and normally it would take me 2 hours and 40 minutes, and listening to it at a higher speed, I got it done in 45. Never in my life had that happened.
And you were able to comprehend, right?
Even much better than what I read.
Yeah. I'm the same. I'm the
awesome.
same way. You know, audiobooks, books on tape, all of that was a lifesaver for me.
So I agree, and that my son mostly does Audible. The problem is, and it's really a question of how literate of a society are we? I mean, my husband and I both have higher degrees in English, so we're like reader writer people. I'm happy for him to listen to Audible, but he needs to learn. Does he need to learn how to read and write like other people? And that's a really important question to me right now.
I think you can still learn how to read and write, because like I'm working on my PhD now, and I feel like because I already know how to read and write, being able to, I process better in an auditory fashion. So I talk to myself too and walk around like he does. And I haven't gotten any new grades since I've started, because I just started all this new stuff, these discoveries this summer. But before this, like I was on Dean's List, high honor roll, and I got into, you know, PhD program. So I don't think it's affected too much.
I think I should start to wrap this up, because I think that's my
Yes, thank you.
responsibility. Yes, because we all have ADHD.
We can
here,
talk about we can talk about this forever.
This is a terrific conversation. I wanted to point out Dr. Fugate's new book, Understanding Twice Exceptional Learners, Connecting Research to Practice. A terrific book. I really recommend it. And also, I had been thinking, my wheels have been turning in my head, thinking of ways of increasing community here, because there is an amazing community. I don't feel like we do a good job capitalizing on this conversations of SBK follow-ups. So I'm going to talk to the leaders here at Bridges about maybe setting up like a mighty network sort of thing, or something where we can we can put up the videos. Everything's in one place. So you have the videos for each week, along with resources, along with discussion forums, so we can all keep the conversation going. So hopefully I haven't overwhelmed Chris with that idea, and I don't get in trouble with this, because I never talked to him about this before. But it seems like this is a really amazing community that we can really build this up in some way. So anyway, thanks everyone for being a supporter of this series, and thanks again, Matt, for being our esteemed guest today.
Hey, I'm happy, and thank you all for a great discussion. I loved it, and please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd love to hear from you and continue some of these conversations.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Cue music.
If you want to email me, Tova, I put my email in the chat, but it's
okay. How do I hold on? Let me take a picture of it. Hold on.
It disappeared though, because we're all chatting away.
No, okay, hold on. I'm gonna.
Stephanie, cue the music.
Okay, there it is. Thank you.
You're welcome. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd love to help.
Awesome. Look at that. We made a connection.
I love it.
That's kind of win.
And by the way, Sarah, hi. And I think I saw Christine Chen on here too. I did a quick scan through the names. And Bettina.